Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 11th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of Vom Vom Krige. The title being "The Political Object Now Reappears." So, the political object now reappears. Here the question which we had laid aside forces itself again into consideration, viz. the political object of the war. The law of the extreme, the view to disarm the adversary, to overthrow him, has either to a certain extent, usurped the place of this end or object. Just as this law loses its force, the political must again come forward. If the whole consideration is a calculation of a probability based on definite persons and relations, then the political object, being the original motive, must be an essential factor in the product. The smaller the sacrifice we demand from our enemy, the smaller it may be expected will be the means of resistance which he will employ. But the smaller his preparation, the smaller will ours require to be. Further, the smaller our political object, the less value shall we set upon it, and the more easily shall we be induced to give it up altogether. Thus, therefore, the political object as the marginal motive of the war will be the standard for determining both the aim of the military force and also the amount of effort to be made. This it cannot be in itself, but it is so in relation to both the belligerent states, because we are concerned with the realities, not with mere abstractions. One and the same political object may produce totally different effects upon different people, or even upon the same people at different times. We can therefore only admit the political object as the measure by considering it in its effects upon those masses which it is to move, and consequently the nature of those masses also comes into consideration. It is easy to see that thus the result may be very different according as these masses are animated with a spirit which will infuse vigor into the action or otherwise. It is quite possible for such a state of feeling to exist between two states, that a very trifling political motive for war may produce an effect quite disproportionate, in fact a perfect explosion. This applies to the efforts which the political object will call forth in the two states, and to the aim which the military action shall prescribe for itself. At times it may itself be that aim, as, for example, the conquest of a province. At other times the political object itself is not suitable for the aim of military action. Then such a one must be chosen as will be an equivalent for it, and stand in its place as regards the conclusion of peace. But also in this, due attention to the peculiar character of the states concerned is always supposed. There are circumstances in which the equivalent must be much greater than the political object in order to secure the latter. The political object will be so much the more the standard of aim and effort, and have more influence in itself the more the masses are indifferent, the less that any mutual feeling of hostility prevails in the two states from other causes, and therefore there are cases where the political object almost alone will be decisive. If the aim of the military action is an equivalent for the political object, that action will in general diminish as the political object diminishes, and in a greater degree the more the political object dominates. Thus it is explained how, without any contradiction in itself, there may be wars of all degrees of importance and energy, from a war of extermination down to the mere use of an army of observation. This, however, leads to a question of another kind which we have hereafter to develop and answer. So, here you read, this is kind of a relatively long paragraph. There are much longer actually in the Vom Krige, but it's relatively simple in its essentials. The political object now reappears. So fundamentally here von Clausewitz has observed, as we have seen, in the previous paragraphs, how war is unavoidably tied and controlled and modified fundamentally by politics at all times. In fact, it doesn't even make sense to say, okay, war starts from a certain point and politics get out of the way. No, politics always dictates fundamentally the effort through which war has, and the objective of war also to a certain degree at all times. This consideration comes at the end of this series of demonstrations in which in the previous paragraphs in which the author has fundamentally demonstrated how the utmost use of force is constantly modified in war, and here explains in fact how the political object leads fundamentally this this control and modification in war. So here he starts, in fact, here the question which we had laid aside forces itself again into consideration. And it says, see paragraph number 2, in which we have von Clausewitz had defined, in fact, the objective of war. That is the political object of the war. In fact, just for recalling, the second paragraph had determined quite clearly the definition of war, which war is fundamentally nothing but a dual on an extensive scale, and therefore is an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. So, yes, not therefore. I mean, the real definition is that war is an act of violence aimed at making our opponent, to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. Here it comes into place, because how do you do it? How do you achieve it? And how fundamentally you decide what is your will? That you have to your opponent to fulfill through this act of violence. So it's naturally a political reason, because war is not fought for the sake of itself. So you must have this reason for which you decide and to use violence fundamentally as a tool, as a mean. So here von Clausewitz says, the law of the extreme, the view to disarm the enemy, the adversary, to overthrow him, niederzuwerfen, as he says, has either to a certain extent usurped the place of this end or object. So, because that was the kind of the neutral, let's say, the abstract point of war, fundamentally. If you have to overthrow your enemy, that's the object point. But it's as if it had in fact usurped the end of the story, because you don't just overthrow someone for no reason. Just don't annihilate this person. You have a reason, you have a will that you have to enforce on your opponent. So just as this law loses its force, von Clausewitz says, the political must again come forward, because the least fundamentally you have reasons to enforce with violence your will, and the more fundamentally the political reason that stands behind assumes a greater importance. And it can be the same political purpose, in fact, at this point, that needs you to control and modify that violence, not to necessarily, annihilate that enemy, but just to, in fact, to compel him to fulfill your will, which may happen also not just through war. So you can have a political action as well as a military action. And the political action sometimes, for example, can be sufficient to compel your enemy to fulfill your will. Then von Clausewitz goes on, if the whole consideration is a calculation of probability based on definite persons and relations, which we have seen just in the 9th paragraph, The political object, being the original motive, must be an essential factor in the product. It's perfectly fine. We've seen in the various demonstrations ex absurdo, fundamentally the last one, third and last one that here he's mostly recalling, that fundamentally war is fought between in this between people that have relations also with people who do not participate to the war directly, or that maybe when the war starts they're still out and they decide to intervene later. So the point here is, what's the original motive for that clash, and how, given that we have seen that the utmost use of force is always mitigated by these relations and what may happen, for which you have to be to extend this utmost use of force and to dilute it fundamentally at best over time. How fundamentally is what's the essential factor in this whole system as a result of this calculation? It is in fact the original motive. It is the original motive. Why is that you're fighting fundamentally? Just for the sake of annihilating someone? But it never happens. There is no reason fundamentally to do it. You need a reason to make your enemy fulfill your will. Okay, you may be a sadist, a psychopath, you just want to do it for the sake of it, but that's a motive, for instance, that is in itself motivated by the fact that there are this given psychiatric conditions at that point. It's kind of a silly example, but it gives you, I use it because even what seems to be the most gratuitous need for violence still has roots eventually in something else. So even in that case, for instance, you realize that you're not an isolated being, so someone might intervene in your condition of being a psychopath. So living in society and so on. So that may be part of the motive, which that utmost use of force is mitigated by over time. This is important to think. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So here, von Clausewitz goes on with kind of in fact, a proportional principle, mathematical principle. The smaller the sacrifice we demand from our enemy, the smaller it may be expected will be the means of resistance which he will employ, quite simply. But the smaller his the sacrifice that he asks us fundamentally, here I think the translation is wrong, because he said preparation, but I think here the Vom Krige says the politician Zweck ist against yeah, okay, well, the Anstrengungen, okay, well, the more, however, this force fundamentally exertion will be, the smaller will ours require to be. So this is very simple concept. I mean, here it says the smaller the sacrifice we demand from our enemy, the smaller we maybe expect will be his resistance. So it's kind of obvious, and that's also fundamentally here it talks about the sacrifice. So fundamentally, we're not even talking about just about war, we're talking about politics and war at the same time. You know, if I poke someone with a stick for no reason, this person in the street, let's assume this person may be you know, kind of altered, etc. But you know, I think rarely he would punch us back in the face, because we're not in fact asking for such a great sacrifice. Can be weird, can be upsetting, can be annoying, but it doesn't necessarily require, you know, such a great violence than this one is fundamentally. You know, he could respond. So the same goes for us. I mean, the more the enemy will fundamentally create a problem, it is a force, preparations against us, etc., the more he gives reasons fundamentally to us to react. And this is pretty normal, and this happens in literally every kind of situation in life, because you always have a kind of conflictual nature with every single being you're in front of. I mean, there is a being who wants to do something. You are maybe just for the fact that you have to check what this being is doing, you're kind of annoyed because you don't know what is is happened to. So there is always this constant relation, for which, by the way, things can vary wildly. In fact, von Clausewitz later says it, and we will see it, that fundamentally even different actions can lead to very different reactions depending on who is the subject that receives it, that suffer it. But this is generally it. I mean, if you really what is that happen, like the oil containers that have been hit by torpedoes by the Japanese fleet, by the Iranians the other day in the Persian Gulf. Well, that's been pretty serious stuff. The oil tankers got on fire. The crew has to be, and we know more or less what happened fundamentally. So, but that's not been enough to bring war between, I don't know, Japan and Iran, or the United States or Iran, simply because it was a relatively small sacrifice for eventually what this was, but this was given the conditions. If this had happened in another context, on the light of this, under the light of the sun, in a moment, I don't know, some of the moments of greatest tensions during the Cold War, this might have caused fundamentally either very different reaction depending on what in fact the political situation really was about, because that was an act of, torpedoing a ship is is evidently an act of violence, is clearly in the sense an act of war, can be interpreted as such by international law, but this does not depend. Here we're talking about war really by definition, the use of violence. Well, this had a certain reaction, and this reaction was dictated chiefly by political factors that today are that nobody really cares about going to war, even if in fact a ship is torpedoed, which is an act of violence and therefore can be perfectly assumed as an act of war, given it's carried out also by probably military instruments. Now I don't really know about military actors. Now I don't really know about the case specifically, but that's still a good example. That's the same reason when I don't know, other actions of war that have been whether decided to be considered as such or not in international arena, fundamentally also by right, because these are matters of law that should also be enforced sometimes. Like there have been active wars, also informatic attacks to entire nations to cause blackouts. This has happened in the past. Or just stepping into with your military into your another country's land, that however have not led fundamentally to open war between two states, because the political situations was fundamentally not was deeming that not to be convenient, and therefore that political object could not bring to open war fundamentally, even if in fact there was a reaction. So here von Clausewitz, which was also military in this nature. So here von Clausewitz is clear, the smaller the sacrifice, the smaller is the reaction, usually. Even if things can vary depending, in fact, at all times from the political aim. Excuse me 1 second. So here we go. Further, von Clausewitz says, the smaller our political object, the less value shall we set upon it, and the more easily shall we induced to give it up altogether. This is also kind of clear. In fact, like the example that we have just done, there might be, something we want to do, but we see that the odds are unfavorable, so say, okay, it was not so important after all, we give it up. This happens in the case, it's just maybe a temporary caprice or something we wanted to do for some minor reason. If it's a matter of, you know, something changing your entire life, you say, okay, the odds may be unfavorable, but I still want to do this, even if it takes a lot of time. So you're more determined, and you're less likely to give it up altogether. So this depends naturally on the here von Clausewitz puts it on the, if I read correctly, in fact on the size, even on this, he used the word, in fact, klein. So literally, the smaller our objective, political object is, and the more easily we shall be induced to give it up altogether. So there are greater and smaller, bigger and smaller political objects that are constantly, by the way, all even interacting the one with the other. I mean, it's really like this. This can be brought very easily, even at an individual level. I mean, think about you now. You have several, you know, objects. For instance, you know, trying to hope that my video will become more interesting the more it goes on, and that may be driving you to listen to me now. Then maybe you're hungry, or you're thirsty, or you're thinking about what you have to do tomorrow, or you're upset because of something. So you have many objects that fundamentally you are trying to frame into an overall action that you expect for you to be carried out in your life now, and this the size of these objects varies constantly, because maybe now I've been talking for too long and you're saying, what the hell, it's boring, let me close this video. Please don't do it. No, of course, I'm kidding, but I mean, that's the real point. Things vary constantly, and this is what von Clausewitz is really telling us, is that it tells much more than just saying the politics control war. But here it says that politics varies constantly. So the political objects can interfere constantly in different ways with war, and war therefore is directly changed, modified, and controlled in a way that can be conducted with a degree of unpredictability, fundamentally, because you're not given. Even if you're a general who is entrusted of a military object, it never ends there. It's never about actually the military object in itself. It's the means you have to reach it, to achieve it. And these means vary constantly on the base of politics, and not just of war, that also is pretty changing. It's ever moving, fundamentally. Is always transforming. You know, military situations evolve constantly, and that's a pretty self-evident reality. Well, this is overly complicated, we could say, by the changing nature of politics, so that not only you have to consider this control, but you also have to put into account that war, even if you wished it to be something isolated, works on its own, fundamentally is never is always depending on something else, and therefore the way it's led, the way it's conducted, changes all the time. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. So, going on, von Clausewitz says, thus, therefore, the political object as the original motive of the war will be the standard for determining both the aim of the military force and also the amount of effort to be made. So this is very clear. So politics, has an object, as we've seen, and this object is fundamentally the original motive of the war. That's the real motive why people fight. It's not for the sake of fighting. as culturalists imagine, like as if the humans were cool about killing each other. It's really not. It's something that goes against the instinct of survival by definition. There is a very, very self-evident motive for fighting that is something that goes beyond the fighting itself, and that on the contrary dictates what in fact both the aim of the war and also the effort that has to be made into it will practically be. So this is particularly important because to distinguish the two things, the military force and the effort to be made, because excuse me, the aim of the military force and the effort to be made, because the aim is naturally, of course, what you want to achieve, and many times we even dream to achieve certain goals in life that can be both political in the sense, so something that have not to do with violence strictly speaking, but sometimes we just say, okay, there may be something I would like to do, achieving it through violence, but eventually I can't do. So in that case you have an aim of the military force, but at the same time you also to determine politically what, so from a perspective that is external to the military one, how much effort you have to do, you have to make fundamentally to achieve that military aim. And this is particularly important because if, of course, the effort is greater, I mean, it can vary. Here from Clausewitz, as if you remember from the red, it actually speaks about it. There can be a certain amount of effort in war is actually greater than the will that you are putting in there. I mean, not necessarily something that will be more costly than what you need to than the benefits, but really literally something that is much greater than your political will, that has to start in this sense to unleash violence in order to achieve something. So you have to measure at all times whether that's fundamentally worth it or not, and this decision is not based on the field while you're fighting, and that's before the war has started, so you have to think it over fundamentally. And what is interesting in this sense is that, psychologically speaking, there is always this option on the table. I mean, while you think about using violence, fundamentally, you're much freer in your intentions than you're free when you're actually delivering that violence, because you fundamentally are scoping all the various chances, all the various options that you have, and you're trying to say, okay, what can I do with my potential? So this is particularly important as a perspective, because it reveals that fundamentally the military option is always on the table for a state, just like the violence is always an option for an individual. But this is just a tool, an instrument, a mean that you're using, that you can use potentially at all times in order to achieve something that you may, however, still not be able to achieve, because it's particularly difficult, as we've seen, also to foresee what the ultimate result of a war or an act of violence can be, given that you're exercising it on a reactive being fundamentally, so they can fight back. So naturally you have to think about all the various potential scenarios that can develop from this action as well. And in fact, von Clausewitz makes another astonishingly concrete statement. It's kind of obvious, we already met it before, but this is just to remind what von Clausewitz is fundamentally interested in, that is not abstractions but real war. In fact, he says this it cannot be in itself, but it is so in relation to both the belligerent states, because we are concerned with realities, not with mere abstractions. And this is perfectly true. So von Clausewitz is reminding us that we're not in a war game or a video game where you're a human, you're fighting against fundamentally certain mechanisms, even if they're maybe guided by other people. So you know the rules, etc. You're talking about reality, the realm of reality with someone else. You're fighting with another entity, here state, that is extremely resourceful. It can fight on so many levels that you can't even imagine. That simulation is not even is able to take into account, because reality is infinitely more complex. And this is important because it reminds one of the reciprocal reactions that we have seen also in the first paragraphs, that is essentially the fact that that the political object is not modulated on only from your side on a passive object that you just have to assault and to tear down. You're attacking on the base of a living reactive force that you have to know both in its physical strength and psychological intentions, and about which you most likely don't know everything, and that fundamentally you have also to study in the moment in which the fight starts. So here there is another variable, or many other variables, that complicate the system as well, because at that point it's not just about your own political object or your military aim or your psychophysical resources, etc. It's also about the ones of the enemy. So you can't fundamentally make a calculation on your own, just thinking about how strongly you can hit by yourself, as if the physical measure, one of your punches, really dictated how things are gonna be. You have to take into consideration many other factors on the base of the fact that you're fighting at least against another opponent that in turn has relations with other people, that on the fact that you also have relations with other people. So this gets extremely complicated, and this is how reality really is. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, one and the same political object may produce totally different effects upon different people, or even upon the same people at different times. We can therefore only admit the political object as the measure by considering it in its effects upon those masses which it is to move, and consequently the nature of those masses also comes into consideration. It is also crystalline clear. You have always to consider on which masses you're exercising your political and military action, both from your side and from the enemy side, because the same political object may produce completely different results on different people or different peoples, and or even these same people but at different times. And these are fundamentally characteristics that, as you understand, are not just merely military. Of course not. They encompass, and not even just merely political. They have to do with lots of other factors that are also chiefly social in this sense, but also material in many ways, and therefore another complicating factor into the equation that in here von Clausewitz is stressing that it can change over time. This is really the point. So the political action, the political object, has to be measured fundamentally on this degree of uncertainty as well. And this uncertainty is fundamentally dictated by the fact that we are not omniscient, but nevertheless we have to add as much as we can, knowledge to this, to the preparation of our political object. Because, for instance, here the nature of the masses on which the political object will exert his power fundamentally is fundamental. Is one of the main things you have to take into consideration. You can't act politically just saying, okay, well, the people will just follow. It's naive. You must have some sort of idea of what, even if you are, let's say, a totalitarian leader and you expect naturally the people to be always, you still have to fear what may happen, because the system may not respond fundamentally to your political object. You will say, it's too costly, we can't do it. And these are problems that happen for real all the time. Even in those extreme contexts. So just think about into a democracy where everything is also more fluid, etc. So this may lead, by the way, to many other interesting considerations. But here, let's stick to what von Clausewitz is talking about. This is still very theoretical. Here, von Clausewitz he's stating what really happens in reality. So he's starting actually to, from the absolute to move into the realm of, how things really happen. But it's still relatively theoretical in the measure in which he's still just showing you how all these forces practically interact, and showing you that this is what happens at all times, but it doesn't tell you fundamentally, also because he cannot, what your specific situation may realize. It is just fundamentally alerting you to make you understand that you can't deal with certain situations thinking that politics has nothing to do with society, or that war is kind of a thing in itself that you can measure in just how strong you are, and not taking into consideration other accounts, other variables. Also because this is not really something you have to read from von Clausewitz. I mean, this is something that von Clausewitz is explaining to you, making you understand how this happens at all times. So this doesn't really, this is not really a prescription. This is a description. He's telling you, look, that even if you know nothing about politics or about war or about society, still the way, if you were theoretically to be put in charge of one of these things, still will oblige you to take into consideration these factors, even if you don't expect it. So this is really the objective in itself of these first paragraphs, is to acquaint you with the fundamentals, the fundamental dynamics, let's say, that exist between politics, war, society, and so on. So the nature of the masses as well also here comes into consideration. Not that that von Clausewitz he's one of the first thinkers that, when considering war and politics in European philosophy, starts tributing a great importance, fundamental importance to the masses, to the feelings of the people. This is particularly important. This is not just because we are in romanticism, so the masses, the peoples, the nations become important in this, but it's really a concrete acknowledgement that has to do naturally also with the period in which von Clausewitz was living, but here is not treated in a subjective way. It's just being stated in the way, in fact, it always happens in every. These dynamics work in all times in history. Then he makes an example. It is easy to see that thus the result may be very different, according as these masses are animated with a spirit which will infuse vigor into the action or otherwise. So it is perfectly valid. I mean, wars are to be regarded also on the degree in which masses actually relate themselves to war. Just think about the American public opinion during the Vietnam War. That was a kind of determining factor, which shows you perfectly well that at that point it was not really what was happening on the field in Vietnam. It was really, what the masses thought about it, and what the importance that started giving to it, and then the politics was affected by it and consequently also the military action. Well, there's a perfect example that shows you how it's one of the best examples actually, historically, also for us today, because we are kind of fresh from it. It's the idea of what Vietnam has been. It's naive to think that the American military capability would have not been able to wipe out the North Vietnamese. But simply there was a political and social cost that at that point came to on the base of many factors that I'm not saying have to be, you know, justified or unjustified. This belongs to another realm. I don't care. It's subjective. But and effectively influenced the war because it came to an end. In fact, with the withdrawal of the U.S. military from Vietnam, from the also from South Vietnam, and in fact was seized by the North Vietnamese. So where were we? Okay, so this is von Clausewitz talk about this vigor that is given also to the action. This is very important. Von Clausewitz was writing with in mind what he called, in fact, the wars of liberation. I mean, the wars that had brought Prussia to be freed from the French occupation, as a matter of fact. So, in that sense, for that was a dramatically important moment for the development of a German national identity, for that would culminate, in fact, half of a century later with the unification of Germany under Prussia, incidentally speaking. So incidentally, and also because of the Clausewitzian theories, because without von Moltke and his military education, we would have not, which was perfectly Clausewitzian, we would have not had a unified Germany, a Second Reich. So this makes you understand also as just as a banal, which is not, however, historical example, how these factors intervene. And what I wanted to say is that, in fact, these wars of liberations were seen as the moment in which the Germans had started, participating also as a mass with vigor into the action. Just figure that, at this point the Napoleonic Wars are a bit a watershed between two eras, and then the 18th century had been a moment in which at least the political theory of the absolute monarchies, which weren't quite absolute, telling the truth, objectively, was that it was just an absolute monarch that decided where to shift the armies and to play, to fight wars as if it was a board game, fundamentally, and that was thought and conceived in that way because of a political propaganda, let's say, but still in those conditions, that's why I say that they weren't quite absolute monarchies in the actual meaning of the term, because still they had to counter the effects of the masses, and that's why, even if France won the American War of Independence against Britain, still, the results were fundamentally pretty harsh, because the enormous political expense that the French had made to hate the American colonies eventually brought to a economical crisis from which the French system didn't recover until the revolution that mostly broke out because of a famine, but contingentally in those years. But the system was pretty messed up by that. So that is a perfect example, in fact, of how, in fact, these monarchies were not absolute at all. In fact, they were overthrown. Same goes paradoxically with the same Brits. Was that the American colonies rebelled? Well, also because the Brits had won the 7 Years' War. So you may say, oh well, we won the war, fine, that time against France. But Britain now got huge parts of what had been French North America. There were huge areas that now the the Brits had to control with garrisons. It costed money, etc. So what they do, they hire taxes. They hire taxes, especially on the American colonies. They have to take on themselves the burden of this garrisons. They're made fundamentally. They're forced to buy certain products that the Brits were exporting from the rest of the world, from India, from about tea, in fact. And that's why, in fact, that people brought to something that led to the American War of Independence and the birth of the United States of America. So that these are all beautiful examples, I would say, that show perfectly that there's not just the use of force, that the use of force is always conditioned by a political object, is always dictated. I think I like this definition best. And that politics has to deal, has to be aware also of the masses, because at that point it was really a matter of masses. Even if you consider still the 18th century revolutions as mostly as a middle class phenomenon, so it still was an elite fundamentally. It wasn't really the masses. The masses is something that started, acting, in fact, mostly in the 19th century in this sense. So because those with the industrialization and so on, the countries became kind of mass societies in this sense. But the idea is still the same, because even in the bourgeois of the 18th century revolutions were part of a system that still encompassed also the mass, the rest of the peasantry and so on. So this is how everything is complexly intertwined. This is what von Clausewitz, that had seen had been living through those things, knew pretty well. And makes another example. It is quite possible, he says, for such a state of feeling to exist between two states, that a very trifling political motive for war may produce an effect quite disproportionate, in fact, a perfect explosion. That fundamentally says a very small thing, a very small action can cause a war that you won't believe, fundamentally. This has this is also perfectly evident in any other, just I think about the Ems dispatch, through which also known as Ems telegram sometimes, it basically incited France to declare war to Prussia in 1870. Or just think about the assassination of Grand Duke Francis Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914. Well, it's not that there are small things, but guess what? There are certain reactive political and social systems that eventually unleash wars that you don't believe. The Ems dispatch triggered this reaction, for which France invades Prussia, and Prussia strikes back, and the Second French Empire is wiped out, and modern Germany is born. So everything from a little dispatch. Of course, what von Clausewitz is saying is that, it's the small little thing that can lead to its explosive reactions, because evidently there are some ingredients in this chemical reaction that are already there and cause the reaction. So those are the masses. Those are the same with World War I. The assassination of the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary brings fundamentally to the First World War, where millions of people die on the battlefields in just 4 years of war all over the world. So this is something really devastating, and it makes you understand that how much the political object here is what that also is based on the masses, dictates what the military action is. Just think about how nationalism had inflated the hatred that existed in the masses before World War I. All this idea that Furor Gallicus against the Furor Teutonicus and all this stuff, the idea that, the French hated the Germans hated the French, all this world in which the masses had participated actively because they were, in fact, exalted by what were political and social reasons. Not that they actually understood what war could have been. In fact, even the political classes underestimated what this war would have become. They were convinced that everything would have been settled in a few months. The war went on for 4 consecutive years. It brought to the horrors of the trench warfare, especially thinking about the Western Front, this massive entrenchment going literally from the North Sea to the Alps continuously, that didn't shift for some kilometers all throughout basically the whole war. A carnage that brings those millions to slaughter themselves. So, yeah, this is the idea, the explosion. And this is important in the theory also. I remember when Bismarck said eventually the next war will start, next European war will start from something stupid happening in the Balkans, and so in fact it happened. Well, this sounds a bit Clausewitzian in itself, so that the state of feeling that exists between two states can even bring to a relatively little event, to produce what von Clausewitz calls an explosion, literally. It's perfectly historically accurate for those examples that we have quoted. So this applies to the efforts which the political object will call forth in the two states, and to the aim which the military action shall prescribe for itself. So this has fundamentally to do with the greatness of the effort that the political aim provokes in the two states. And in the immediate object through which it intends to achieve, to reach with the act of war, fundamentally. So, he says, at times, it may itself be that aim, as, for example, the conquest of a province. At other times, the political object itself is not suitable for the aim of military action. Then such a one must be chosen as will be an equivalent for it and stand in its place as regards to the conclusion of peace. So he says this political object varies, as we've seen. So sometimes it varies to it swings between certain extremes, fundamentally. At times it might be that fundamentally the political object is all one with the aim of military action. For example, here I want to seize a province. So at that point my political object is taking that province for, I don't know, it's rich in minerals and I want to become wealthier. And therefore I will do everything it will take to, I will measure, the pros and cons, fundamentally, and modulate my military action to, however, achieve that same goal that fundamentally the practically politics has, that is literally incorporating that province. So here the political aim and military aim are overlapping, even if they are on two different levels. But fundamentally they are achieving the same identical result. And other times it may happen is that the political object itself is not suitable for the aim of military action. That is fundamentally, in other words, I don't really need to use violence to achieve one goal, or at least I could, but maybe for me it's not convenient now. So if fundamentally this inconvenient, the greater this inconvenience it is, and fundamentally the more I discard the military option, and if this reaches the, you know, the if fundamentally I can achieve the same thing through political means rather than military ones, well, at this point in war it's useless even to keep on fighting, because at that point let's conclude a peace and settle the terms, because now we are in a condition of force that doesn't require further fight, because we have fundamentally already achieved the result. It's a bit like when in that other paragraph, von Clausewitz had said that, if we all knew what the political, the result of war would be, if everybody was aware of the relations, the strength relations among the various states, there would not be no need to fight, and everything in terms of dominance would be solved into a sort of algebraic calculation. Well, here it's relatively, at least from a conceptual view, a bit similar thought, because it says fundamentally now the military action is not enough. Is not required to achieve that political objective, because now the conditions bring me to be able to impose to the enemy that condition without using violence. So he will compel to my will. He's already compelled to fulfill my will, and I don't need to use further violence. So this is, let's go to determine this in a political seat, and this is achieved. So this last example is also very meaningful, because it makes you understand how war is fundamentally just really a tool. You don't have to make war for the sake of it. You just have to achieve that goal. That's it. If it requires war, you use war. Otherwise, it doesn't, and you're not obliged to do it. So this is very important for understanding really the importance of the political object at the root of wars. If you think the wars are fought by humans because just they enjoy blood and violence and stuff like that, you haven't understood much about human nature. But this is what many people out there, like culturalists or even pacifists, or both at the same time, what a horror, try to make you believe, is that fundamentally politics shall be always nice. There should be never violence, because if you like violence, you're just a brute. Well, okay, go tell that to the partisans that resisted to Nazi occupation during World War II. They didn't have to use violence, because I'll say, oh well, but there are pacifist reactions. There can be pacific resistance. Well, no, because history teaches us, there can be effective pacific non-violent resistance, which is also relatively untrue also in those historical examples where it's usually regarded, but only if the conditions allow you to achieve some goal. In fact, this is what von Clausewitz has literally just said, that there may be political movements that do not actions that do not require violence to be achieved, and therefore, okay, peace, okay. But in certain other cases, there aren't. Nazi occupation was one of those cases. You have to fight against it. And even if now it gets complicated, it still gets complicated by war, by politics, because there were also collaborationists, for instance. So that is a peculiar, that is kind of a very meaningful thing. There were partisans who fought actively because of their political ideas regarding the Nazis, and therefore this entails a lot about civical duties and so on. So there were other people who said, okay, maybe they didn't like the Nazis either, but it's like, okay, let's coexist with these because they're kind of brutal, they're kind of strong, and resistance can happen with a very high cost that I personally will not take, and that's what kept Nazi occupation going on. So it's naive to believe that a war is something you can discard from the political option, because as a matter of fact it's always there by definition, and in certain cases it's way better to use that option, because it will probably kill less people than ones that will be killed if you go on do nothing. Like it happened with the Holocaust, for instance, and the other 4 millions that, aside from the Jews, also were killed in Nazi concentration camps. So this is particularly meaningful in my opinion. That's why it took the blood of millions to get rid of Nazi tyranny. That is particularly important. So, and this has to do naturally with the military action that is being waged upon Germany and its allies, and that's the real point. That's the real point. Then of course you can condemn also other things. You can say, okay, well maybe there were certain military operations were kind of useless, like hitting civilian objectives, like historical centers, the German cities, that eventually caused, instead of the break of German morale, actually the Germans to fight even harder, and that is today usually regarded as useless in terms of, so not just in losses of human life, but also of artistical, cultural goods. And yeah, okay, but if you had, that was a mistake, for instance, but still the whole use of violence is not. It's also very interesting. This opens to very wide philosophical, deep philosophical questions. Like, I don't know, think about the American War of Independence. Just recently I heard a perspective that I'd never thought of. Actually, I thought about it in general Christian terms, but I'd never in that associated to especially the American the American War of Independence, because that fundamentally there is the idea that the founding fathers were still inspired by Christian principles, were at the base of American society and so on, but the Gospels say fundamentally that you should obey the constituted authority, the local political authority. So I've heard I don't remember who he was, actually was a guest of a show, and he was saying, he was a I think a theologist fundamentally. He was saying, I would have not done it if this was an American, and said at the time I would have not fought in the War of Independence. I would have not taken a weapon for fighting, because in the Gospel it's written that I don't have to do it. So there should be a kind of other means through which this is achieved. Now this is particularly interesting because eventually America, that the United States were born, politically speaking, with this idea that Americans were kind of a chosen people, were fighting for a freedom that was much larger than just a political freedom. It was fundamentally individual freedom. It was based on the freedom that God had entrusted to man. It was conceived like a natural law. This is Jewish naturalism that fundamentally inspired the theoretical political theory, of many, not just of the founding fathers, but many other philosophers and politicians at the time. So that's a question leaves open, and von Clausewitz in a certain sense reconfirms it, because von Clausewitz is never telling you should go to war for the sake of it. Many people were, I think, really in this sense, grossly ignorant about this topic. Think that whoever writes, I don't know, just for having written a treatise on war, von Clausewitz is just a warmonger and someone who enjoys war and I think he would have been pretty and deeply upset and disappointed if he had heard such a thing. Von Clausewitz never tells you that war is good. We will read it. He talks about war, his experience on the field, etc. It shows all the horror of what it is, and that's one, by the way, one of the few moments in which he carries himself away by saying very, not very subjective things, because he remains always didactic in this, but he says, whoever has been to war knows how terrible that is, and would never wish to be in it, fundamentally. So the point he makes is that if you really want, the whole reason why the treatise is, that Vom Krige has been written, is to, to actually drive humans into a war by acquainting them with what war is. Because von Clausewitz's hope is not that there will be more wars in this sense, but that the wars that will be fought will be actually functional, will not be political mistakes, and will be kind of reasonable wars that have to be fought for, precise reasons that at that point are hopefully inescapable. So this is a great message that von Clausewitz is telling us. Everything stems from politics. Everything stems from your individual responsibility as a citizen, your civic ethics, fundamentally, that makes you individually responsible for the use of violence. And this is probably the most didactic thing that you can think, because if you keep thinking, like many people do objectively, that war is something that is floating in the airs, just maybe fought by evil and greedy people who want to rule the world for the sake of it. They haven't really understood much about what war really is. They haven't, and they're probably the people who, in this kind of radical dogmatism, would be the most likely to actually cause a war for no valid reason, and why perhaps their governments wage it, because this is fundamentally it. You vote, at least if you live in certain areas, most areas of the world, good chances are, fortunately today, wherever you live in the world, you live in a democracy, at least by name. And your role matters. Your individual action does matter, does make a difference. This is what von Clausewitz is saying. You are the one who has, in this mess of factors, political, military, social, to determine what's the best option. And it's extremely difficult to do it. And you can't do it if you fundamentally don't know what you're doing. You're gonna have serious troubles fighting a war if you don't know what a war is, and that's why he wrote the Vom Krige. Then he says also, but also in this, due attention to the peculiar character of the states concerned is always supposed. So it says also in here, when let's say we have seen it, war fundamentally takes the political action takes over war, so that you conclude a peace, and because let's say violence is not necessary anymore. Still, also in here, the peculiar character of states has always to be supposed. So here he is stressing, in my opinion, the fact that the continuity that exists between politics and war, so that you're never talking about two distinguished things. That even when the hostility, the violence is ceased because war is over, still the motives that brought to that war are kind of alive in part, or at least have evolved into this a line that is always politically led. So it's always a matter of it's always about politics determining whether war will break out again or not, and it never ends. So it's always reversible, so that violence is always there. The end of a war doesn't mean there will be less wars in the future. It all depends on what you do now will your political object, with your political actions uh, that behave accordingly. And let's just repeat it for stressing importance here. The war is just a continuation of politics by other means, nothing by that. Which sounds kind of, also this phrase is being sometimes misread. It's easy to misread if you don't get into the Clausewitzian theory in itself, but here it's not saying that war is something here that uh, it's not a banal phrase. This is the point. It's not that war is magically something on its own that pops out from from politics as just a mere mean, because politics continue to dictate war, continue to control it, to modify it, and this relation never ends. Politics never ends in the meanwhile. War can break out and come to an end. Politics is always alive. As long as there is a society, there is always politics. So war is just in this sense a consequence, and what should be scary in the definition of politics of war is just a continuation of politics by other means. It's not war that evokes this terrible spectacular destructions and sufferings and so on, but politics, because that's what it triggers. When you hear this phrase, I think people just are fascinated by the word, literally by the word war, and they do not understand the extremely frightening messages that lays. Politics in comparison sounds something nicer, kind of a bit messy, bit chaotic, bit of people quarreling, but it's fine. But war is the terrible thing. No, the really terrible thing is politics. The really frightening, one of the most frightening things ever. That's our human condition, our civilization. The most frightening thing we should be extremely mindful of is politics. Never to say, okay, politics is bad, is dirty. We don't have to think about it. It's all false. Let's delegate it to someone else because I don't care. No, that's quite the contrary. If you really care about things like war not to happen for unnecessary reasons, you should take politics in your hands, because that's the only way you can fundamentally control the use of violence, and you personally make a difference. So that's the deepest message perhaps you can draw from the Clausewitzian theory, aside from all the extraordinarily amazing thing, and also perhaps more interesting thing, especially for military historians, about the conduct of war. Here von Clausewitz also said there are circumstances in which the equivalent must be much greater than the political object in order to secure the latter. So here, fundamentally, the here is talking actually about the military equivalent. This would be the maybe better translation of this this passage. There are situations fundamentally in which the military equivalent must be well greater fundamentally of the political aim, the political object in itself, because this could be achieved. This is particularly important because it basically says, okay, I want to achieve something, but I could make a hell of a war to get to it. So this is also true, that the war can grow so costly to fundamentally to achieve one result that we can say it's not worth it, but at the moment seems in fact something smaller than something more relatively more contained than what we think. It's like with I don't know, here I admit that I have some difficulty in understanding the passage, because I don't understand, and therefore I ask to you as well, if there is some expert out there, is that how can really the political object be posed in terms of equivalency to the military one? You know, we can see that the object overlaps, and but the it's like the example before with the province. You know, you here there says, you know, the political object and military one, military aim fundamentally overlap, because if I want to seize a province, that's it. But I have political reasons that are kind of different from the way war is waged to seize that province, for instance. So what is really von Clausewitz talking about in here? It's me why I don't understand, and it's not because of von Clausewitz. Here probably it's just me being dumb. It's surely just me being dumb. But the general idea here that I think is that there are evidently certain wars that require a much greater cost than what the political purpose had foreseen. This might be an interpretation. So it's kind of evident. It's like I was thinking about World War I, in fact, in this sense. You know, that you see how in that case the political action brought to the slaughter of millions sometimes that at the end of the war, say, was not worth it. Think of all the offensives that have been launched in World War I and eventually were bogged down in the bloody mud of the trenches that failed, like battles of Sedan, Verdun, the zones of offensive on the Italian front. I mean, all literally human tides that were infringed over the barbed wires and machine guns and bayonets. I mean, that's really how that political action that was calculated on the base of, let's say, also expecting a less, much less bloodshed, instead turned into, a meat grinder that nobody had kind of expected. Or maybe, this still happened, especially after the first months of war. This was perfectly clear that trench warfare would have gone on that fashion. They tried to, of course, to break it, but now all the headquarters had fundamentally understood what the new dynamics were. Just for the record, the myth that World War I went on with generals thinking that, the trench warfare was just a temporary situation, in the sense that it didn't have to be taken into consideration. Men were sent just to slaughter, because generals had not understood how trench warfare worked. It's plain stupid and anti-historical. After 2 or 3 months of war, now every general had perfectly clear in mind how trench warfare worked. Trench warfare was extremely sophisticated, by the way. This myth of brutal warfare, if something brutal is therefore unsophisticated, that's absolutely false. Trench warfare was one of the most sophisticated warfare. It was incredibly developed in many ways. But that is an example, in my opinion, what von Clausewitz is telling here, is that you may achieve a political aim with a cost that is much greater. Now, this may be... I'm still puzzled a little bit, because of the equivalence fundamentally of the quantification of a military object with an absolute cost, because that's the only way the equation can be solved. But von Clausewitz never talks about absolute costs, because it's always the political action that gives a cost gives a value to human life, even. So I'm a bit puzzled by this statement, but it's I need probably better. Well, I'd say if I manage to decipher it better, I will tell you on another occasion. But comprehensively kind of makes sense, and it's evident that you need a huge military effort to achieve a political object that seems small. It's like, whatever. Because here it's the object, they're not even the political consequences. It's like saying, I don't know, the Soviets ran for Berlin, getting slaughtered en masse by the Germans in defense during World War II. The political object was to seize Berlin before the Allies could, the Western Allies could. So, in that sense, there was a moment in which even the same Soviet Stavka said something like, "Let's overthrow Stalin." This in 1944, when Stalin was kind of at the acme of his power, because the sheer human losses of the Soviets were something astonishing. I mean, they lost people in millions. I mean, they lost people in millions. You can imagine when they were defending defense against the Nazis. You can imagine now that the Nazis were defending what the cost really was. I mean, the Eastern Front in this sense was a meat grinder at levels that are difficult for a human mind to actually picture. So this might be the sense, in my opinion. However, here it says the political object will be so much the more the standard of aim and effort and have more influence in itself, the more the masses are indifferent, the less that any mutual feeling of hostility prevails in the two states from other causes, and therefore there are cases where the political object almost alone will be decisive. Now here also is a bit of a relatively complex sentence. Maybe rephrase it in a more literal fashion. Let's see here. I had translated something saying fundamentally that the political purpose will have in itself, as measure of a force, an influence that is more prevalent and decisive the more the masses are indifferent, and how much less tension exists naturally between the two states. In some cases, the influence of the political purpose thus becomes almost exclusively decisive. I like this translation of mine best. It's kind of clearer, because it basically says that fundamentally that politics has a greater impact also as a measure of a force, etc., and therefore in directing the military instrument. The less tension, the more the masses are indifferent, and the less tension exists naturally between the two states. Because here basically it means that if the masses are indifferent and the tension between the states is lower, fundamentally, the political action has a greater effect. I mean, if you really have this, fundamentally the control on the masses is greater at that point, because you can induce them to do what you like because they're less different. Here, just remember that it's still relatively theoretical, as we were saying before, as a consideration, because you can't really determine whether most of the times whether the masses are going to be indifferent or not. But nevertheless, it's evident that the more the people doesn't care, and more it's easy for the political side to unleash wars. Take an example like Russia in the last decades. It has waged war fundamentally to several times, with the Russian people really not caring or being maybe even supportive in this sense of the action, because they imagine it in a completely distorted fashion, because they were told fundamentally in those terms that made it suspended in the air. This is something that I've met very easily in such circumstances, where you talk with people who do not know politics, who do not know history, who incidentally tend to dramatize history in their own way, but to completely flip it in the moral sense that they want. This is typical, especially I've met I believe a Russian politics. It's pretty clear that if you ever talked with several people from from that context, you realize that they don't really care about what reality is. They just prefer that there is their own country that is kind of nice and pure, and the others all kind of hate it. And now they, every time that their country intervenes, it's because it's a positive. It's a positive thing fundamentally, because they're right, because they are that country. And what you discover in that context is that they're fundamentally indifferent even to what happens politically speaking, not just militarily, because they live in a country that politically is, on the verge of authoritarianism, almost a certain close to some, at least, dictatorial features, and because of an evident past that brought the state to develop in that fashion, you realize they simply don't know. So in that case, the masses are indifferent, and that is very politically convenient. Do you ever think about it? Think about in dictatorships or totalitarianisms. The masses are ignorant. Why are they ignorant? So that their governments can wage war, not just war, but everything political at that point, but including war. This is the Clausewitzian paradigm. So that they don't care, so that they don't realize, so that they don't know. Maybe their individual life quality can sink, and they will notice that. But overall, if you make small wars, like invading a tiny province and so, they will not notice. They will not pose it, pose themselves the question whether it's a positive thing or a negative thing. Because as long as you fundamentally isolate masses, also from the rest of the world, is saying, look, you're doing something seriously wrong, stop it, the masses will not care. They will not hear that. If you isolate them, if you make them convinced that they are the center of the world, the rest of the world does not exist, well, this is how certain wars have been waged, recently speaking. And that's how you realize that it's easy to do with people that are fundamentally ignorant. There are people who have an understanding of what things that happen really are. And they're all the flipping narratives like, it's all relative. All politicians are evil. That's also another typical Russian phrase. Well, thanks my eyes, but this doesn't mean that some are worse than others, and there are political and military actions that are worse than others. Seriously, massively. You can't escape it just saying, well, it's all false. That's typical disinformation. That's typical that the Soviets the Russians have been masters of disinformation, because that's how you can achieve also those political and military goals. And it's clever, and it works. But it only works here, and that's what von Clausewitz is saying, in fact, describing perfectly. The more the masses are indifferent. And therefore, in this particular context, if masses are disinformed, they don't know what's happening, and therefore they're obviously indifferent, because if you don't know something, you can't know, you can't even take a stand, to take a position on the issue. Now that's particularly interesting, and very few people understand how dramatically serious this is, and this is why reading von Clausewitz should actually wake up many, because if they only knew this concept, they would start reflecting on how certain things happen, and why certain people are in a certain way, why certain events happen, why certain wars are waged, on which premises, on which basis. If you flatten everything, you can't. You're a moral relativist. That's the point. You can't justify everything, and that's what it's against this that we said we have built a civilized world. That is very, very different. That still can see these things happening, but on the basis of with the least developed fundamentally. So this is today I got a bit political, especially now with this last example, but it is true. You understand it. If I know that people out there are kind of crazy and that think, many people at least are. Many people know what I'm talking about. Many people really do not know, and I think the crazier they are, then because it's the least they know about these issues, and this is what is dramatically evident, in my opinion, regarding to what happens around the world, and we should pose ourselves many questions about um, the so I would say this is clear. And what is also interesting though is that von Clausewitz says that political object will be more able to dictate the standards and effort the less the paradoxically the feeling of hostility prevails in two states from other causes. Now this is also particularly interesting because he's saying, and it's not to be given for granted. I mean, two states can not necessarily fundamentally. Two states, let's say it better. Politics controls less states who are hostile between each other from other causes than the political object. So fundamentally, it could be easier to push these two states to war because they hate each other. But paradoxically, it would be more difficult to do it for the right political aim because the feelings of hostility of these two populations will fundamentally alter the rational character of politics, the calculation that should bring to an actual war. This is particularly important because many times in history, in fact, there were states that went at war not because they have thought it thoroughly, but simply because they felt hostility one against the other, just measuring their political aim on the base of their feelings, not of reason. And there are also here we shouldn't make mistakes because there are wars that instead are dictated by mere political actions. Before we were thinking, in fact, about we were making an example of dictatorships, of totalitarianisms, who make wars without actually, I mean, trying to detach, or at least the people, or in that case, even to orientate their hate through propaganda and so on. So creating this artificial feelings of hostilities that are, however, aimed at making the people orientated towards the right political ends of their government. But here, von Clausewitz is talking about other causes. He's talking fundamentally about the fact that a state that goes to war against another by a political direction is gonna have trouble in controlling this thing if the masses have other reasons for hating this country from the ones that eventually that actually brought the government to war. So this can translate itself in many ways, for instance, of a country being too eager to go to war and pushing actually politics in the government, because this is also it. The government is not undetached from the people, so the government constantly is put under pressure and sometimes is also guided by the people, who says you have to do this, otherwise you're out of here. So this kind of happens. There are certain more parallelisms we could do, but I would skip it because I would get even more political than what I did before. Actually, also from the other side of the barricade, let's say. But it's evident that certain wars are fundamentally fought because public opinion is fine with that. For instance, and this historically is pretty much out there. So also this is interesting because this also kind of dispels the myth that it's always the poor, pure-minded and souled population that always suffers of the poor tyrants that are at the top. No, as a matter of fact, it's not like that. This is an obsession that exists in many countries of the Western world, especially in the Anglosphere. The idea that there is a tyrant that dictates on the poor people who are sent to war because they're such pure angels, poor dears, that they're brought to war on the points of the bayonets. Historically speaking, this is also false. This is false. Actually, I would say not really most of the times. The striking difference is obviously that you may hate someone, but not hate him so much to go to war and risk your life for him. So you can rightfully say things that, I don't know, the German soldiers of the Wehrmacht were sent to war because otherwise they would have been executed. Yes, this is true, but this still doesn't count that only 40% of Germans didn't vote for Hitler in 1933. So how do you put that? You vote for someone that eventually makes, at least at the time, political intimidation, violences, assassinations, and that openly claims that that there has to be active discrimination against certain ethnic groups and so on. And then, yeah, okay, you all of a sudden you become a pure angel because you're sent to war. Well, of course, there is a kind of empathy that you can feel for anyone that suffers into war, that is sent there, that is you can even detach kind of the military behavior from the political behavior in a certain sense. But cui prodest, what's the point at the end of the story? Most of the times in history, actually, countries were kind of, the peoples of the fighting countries were for actually annihilating the other. If you really look at it historically speaking, most of the people who went to war were actually for saying, these fucking bastards from the other side, I would like to eat their guts, fundamentally. So that was the truth. And we have to erase this puritanism when it comes to interpret history, like saying, oh, we were sent there, it's not our fault, we're just passive victims of a terrible tyrant, it's all about the tyrant. No, because the governments are moved by the masses. The great totalitarianisms of the especially fascism and Nazism were actively backed by the respective populations. Do these populations actually democratically voted for these dictatorships to rise to power? So you may say, okay, there was an evolution within these dictatorships that kind of made them grow worse over time, that even they, at the end of the day, especially in certain countries, kind of disaffection to the same population. Yeah, okay, but still the political responsibility belongs to the masses in that case. So you can't say, you can't even deny the responsibility of the tyrant in that context, but at the same time, still, this is not about moral anymore. This is actually describing how it practically happened. This is what von Clausewitz is telling us. Look, that the masses also can seriously mess up things, politically speaking, especially also in war, because they may go at war for reasons that and in ways that are kind of wrong. This was practically it. Also because the masses still make up the armies. If you think about it, it's still, here we're talking about citizens most of the times, but this is evident also in tribal warfare, in other contexts where the military participation was always actually tied to the political belonging, to the political protagonism. If you think about and this is particularly important because today I believe that we live in a world where we kind of feel we kind of grew deresponsibilized in a certain fashion. Yes, we acquired our own individual rights, we kind of live well, because ultimately the reason why why there were so many political clashes for rights representation was that people actually lived wars because of the lack of those rights. Now we kind of live fine, we can't really complain. Yeah, life, generally speaking, I think life is beautiful, but by certain standards, yeah, you can say it sucks, that there are people who still have generally many difficulties, many problems, but that's kind of a human existential condition. But politically speaking, we kind of now got what we wanted in the last century or so, mostly, also starting from the 19th and even before. But this is a very long time process. But we we kind of all have, in terms also of political representation and ultimate decision, we're less important. First of all, we are more people. This is also important. Before, societies were kind of much smaller, so you had individually kind of much greater impact on how things went. Well, in that case, the bond between individual object, let's say, and an action, and moral responsibility was much more evident. Today, it's not, because today it's very easy to live in a country that is kind of well off by certain standards and saying, okay, my government does bad things, but yeah, but I don't care, I'm different, I'm even from another political side. And what you do instead of then fighting back, let's say, is simply saying, okay, but I don't care. I have my Facebook, I have my smartphone in general, I can do whatever I want all the time, and I don't care. I have ways to entertain myself, let's say, with other stupid stuff that fundamentally have nothing to do, only in appearance, with politics. Because first, you're doing those things is actually distracting you from more important things. Secondly, even doing those things actually has an effect. Because if you use a certain site, you're automatically giving money to someone, even if you don't realize it. Because you do it for your own personal, relief, to enjoy this, to get notifications, to be looked at, to be followed. It's my case. You may be happy about it, but at the same time, you may be doing for yourself. I incidentally don't try not to. I mean, I like it as in some measures, but like anyone, but mostly created Schwerpunkt exactly for discussing about these things and being aware of what you do. So that's way more important to me as a general aim. I don't do it for never being hungry for attention, fortunately. The contrary, I mean, even a too reserved person sometimes. I tend to keep things for myself only, but that's the point. You still have an effect. You still have a political impact of some sort if, to make it stupid, you go to the supermarket and instead of one product you choose another. Because yeah, you're free to do it, but it's not just about freedom, it's what you do with that freedom and how you preserve that freedom. There are people who are given freedom and do not know what to do with it. And that's a serious problem. And it's actually a problem from everyone, because we all kind of waste our resources in a certain manner, in a certain measure, and we could do better. And I would say at this point the most important thing is just acknowledging that and acting accordingly. Like saying, okay, I know today I'm gonna waste time in part, but still if I do better than what I did yesterday, maybe this world is gonna be better. And this is how really the world works. Like sometimes for instance, I don't know now whether my videos are kind of useful or not. I don't know what effects they're having on the world, the way the world goes. I like to think that, if I get enough views, something in the world will change, maybe because people have heard my ideas and they will start thinking about them and developing their own in turn and acting differently. So I like the idea that we can improve. So sometimes in the day I say, okay, I don't want to make the video today because it takes a lot, I'm tired, I don't want, but at the end of the day I always say, okay, you know what, this is kind of useful, this is kind of allegedly for a good purpose. At least if I'm able to deliver some effective material, some effective idea, I can do something better. So that's also kind of a driving factor, and that's what von Clausewitz indirectly is kind of telling you. You can't just see things passively. You can't just look at things sectorially, like saying, okay, I am me, I'm a sort of monad, whatever I do doesn't affect other people. No, everything has an effect constantly. That's the Clausewitzian trinity: government, army, and people. They're all intertwined, because whatever happens along this tree has an effect on all the others. I also hate, frankly, also relatively to the military, how also in the West we are fundamentally looking at, especially in certain countries, as the military as something kind of detached, like a caste. Sometimes the military also behaves like this in turn, so it's going both ways. But it's, yeah, this idea that from one side there are the civilians that are in their own world, from the other side there are the military men who are in their own world, even maybe abroad. So who cares, you know? No, we should take back the awareness that whatever happens in our society, it's in part our own responsibility, and this affects whatever happens all around us, in terms of politics, in terms of war. So you can't just switch on, I don't know, whoever watches TV anymore, but let's say, uh, follow the news daily just for 5 seconds and say, oh, okay, this crazy thing happened. Well, I don't care. Something happening somewhere else. No, because that is happening in the same place where you will live on Earth. So, and that would be. So, you can't reason like that. You can't alienate yourself. And it's very easy instead to alienate yourself, especially through the internet. This is important. That's why I try to make these sidebars, because in the videos, because I believe that everything we talk about, it's not just about politics. I mean, it's not just about history. Sometimes I'm disappointed by. I realize how even these videos on Vom Krige are not listened to so much, or not watched so much, because they think it's just some crazy, thinker of the 19th century nobody actually knows and said a bunch of things. Maybe they're not even true. No, Vom Krige is much more than this. Vom Krige has this enormous importance for our own, for building our own our ethic, our civil responsibility, because it really shows you how things are. It really tells you, in an orderly fashion, how these relations, and this is the relations work. This is important, because really, if we have seen now, Schwerpunkt has been going on for more than 1 year. We've seen many times in Schwerpunkt how you can't deal with history just as a story that you want to know. Most of the people deal with history like this. I'm sure, I'm sorry about this, but I know also many of my followers actually reason in this way. I see it from the stats. I see them from the tastes they have. I see from the stuff they like and how much they listen to it. And I can say that aside from a bunch of, of elite that also kind of participates, that tries to understand, that applies itself, there is not such a great progress. Because most of the people are just torpidly asleep in this world that only bombards them with useless stuff, doesn't make them think, doesn't develop their criticism, and does not help society as a whole, just orientate people towards certain tastes for clicking, for watching, because that ultimately makes people make money. If you watch Schwerpunkt, just know that, yeah, maybe you give a bit of money to YouTube, because that's what I also do indirectly, but if you give time to Schwerpunkt, your views, you're giving views to something that really helps people growing, aside from my own, let's say, incapability of delivering contents in an effective way for many reasons. But, if you watch Schwerpunkt, you at least are acquainted with, and this is what I hope really I can do. If I have, several hundreds subscribers at this point, I want to hope with all myself for this reason. It gives something for building a more critical thought. That's how I try to make the channel about. That's what I honestly want it to be, because, what do I care? I could go on with my stuff every day, not wasting hours talking here. What do you think I do it for? Is it for money? No, because let's be honest, nobody makes money through these things. It's or not enough for all the time and effort it takes to me for doing what I do. But it makes people thinking. So if I make it, even for one person, to make that person think something new, to make that person ask, wonder, go look, and open up a book and learn something better. Well, I know I have achieved something. Of course, I can do it also on my own and try to invest on my own, but this is a great mean of communication. If that happens for one person, I can be happy, but it doesn't really repay me. If that starts happening for hundreds of people, well, maybe that starts being a profit, even for myself, because I live in a world where technically there are people who are kind of got more interested about reality and try to figure it out in a more accurate fashion. This is my objective personally. I don't do it for other particular reasons. I feel, on the contrary, that it's pretty irrational for me to make these videos by certain standards. It's useful because I read, because I learn several new things every time. In order for preparing these videos, you understand what I mean. But just by preparing these videos, because I read, so I've learned many things from Schwerpunkt myself. But it's more than that. It's really, and that's why I started the Vom Krige series. Because we may need to make clarity. I mean, I find astonishing that in 2019, at this point of development of civilization, where everybody can access knowledge freely, practically, and can learn and can grow, nobody cares. Nobody gives a damn and doesn't even think about the relations that exist between politics, war, society, and just thinks that in weird ideological, moralistic, fundamentalistic ways, and doesn't actually understand a damn thing of what's going on. Von Clausewitz is not a read for literally everybody. It should be studied, especially by people who have kind of a decent knowledge of many things, philosophically, historically, linguistically. But if we can polarize the attention towards him, I'm sure there are more people who will manage to learn well about him. And that's why I'm talking about him, and that will understand the world better and will make better choices. And this is it at the end of the day. So, concluding the phrase, that this is a big digression, concluding the phrase that we were reading, so in the case of the indifference of the masses and the mutual feeling of hostility prevailing in the two states from other causes, political object always alone will be decisive. I mean, the more this happens, the more a political object tends to be decisive. Just a little note, the mutual feeling of hostility, this is also something we didn't stress. It's not just about the single state having a feeling of hostility towards another, but also in this sense, I believe the capacity of these two states of hating each other and therefore making this fight a personal thing rather than a reasonable thing, which happens unfortunately among many people, so that you don't have to count just the hatred that drives one single state. You have to consider it always in relation to the belligerent states. This is what von Clausewitz has said today, and it has always to be taken into consideration as a real situation, because otherwise it's abstraction. You don't hate. In order to hate, you have to hate someone. That's the point. There's this inner conflictuality in human nature that you always find, you always experience, and that conditions the wrestling in this fashion, and it can't be ignored or overlooked or underestimated. So in these conditions, if the masses are indifferent, if they don't have any mutual kind of feeling of hostility, the more the political object alone will be mostly decisive. Because it's as if there was no attrition fundamentally that could bring to war, to the political object to be shifted somewhere else. This is the end of the meaning. Then it says, if the aim of the military action is an equivalent for the political object, then action will in general diminish as the political object diminishes, and in greater degree the more the political object dominates. So this is also pretty clear. So fundamentally, if the if the objective of the military act makes up the same political object, there is this direct proportion between the importance of the political the political aim is, the political intensity is. So it will lose, in general, importance. The military action will lose more importance compared to the military one, to the political one, sorry. How more the political objective will be prevalent. So the most important thing that is, which is the conclusion of this paragraph, is that thus it is explained how, without any contradiction in itself, there may be wars of all degrees of importance and energy, from a war of extermination down to the mere use of an army of observation. This, however, leads to a question of another kind, which we have hereafter to develop and answer. So I admit also the previous phrase was not entirely clear. Should retranslate it better. So that, no, well, I think the first phrase can be more clearly explained. Fundamentally, that there is this direct proportion. I mean, the more the political intensity, this is very clear actually. It is very clear as a phrase instead. The more the political intensity, the more the military action is intense, fundamentally. The less the political aim diminishes, the more the political object diminishes, also the military action will diminish, because it's directly proportional. So this is the logical conclusion of von Clausewitz, is that there is no contradiction in all sorts if you find degrees in which the energy delivered varies widely. So this is particularly important because also on a moralistic ground, as people like to make in general, there are certain wars like saying, oh, this is a small war, okay, let's do it. And this is a war of extermination. Oh no, this is terrible. Let's not do it. Because, of course, they're pretty wild extremes. Here, von Clausewitz actually makes the example of the mere use of an army of observation. So, basically an armed force that intervenes even on the field but doesn't quite kill anyone because it's just observing. The other is the war of extermination. Naturally, we have put certain limits to even to war, but if you in its destructiveness. But we have seen that in von Clausewitz, even if there are certain international laws that try to mitigate the destructiveness of war, fundamentally you realize that war, these are virtually influent, and that war actually always destroys in the same way. So it's even difficult here to define what a war of extermination is, because we have seen that main object of war is to disarm the enemy, but this could happen, as a matter of fact, mostly happens through extermination. Doesn't matter that whether extermination is circumscribed to just one enemy unit. That expands also into other, even in the civilian field. I mean, this extermination, this destruction actually occurs. So what von Clausewitz here is that there is fundamentally no intimate difference between these two kinds of wars. Because it's not about war changing nature. It's about the energy given it by politics that varies. This is also very important because it can be easily explained through kind of a physical metaphor. It's as if you have an engine and you give it more or less fuel. That's basically it. And more powerful than engine. I mean that yeah, the more work that engine will achieve fundamentally. The engine is kind of a fixed machine. It always works in the same way, but war is something different. War can modulate itself, can expand, can contract, all depending on these factors. So what he's saying now is that it's silly to look at war as if there were wars that are kind of different one from the others in the way they are fought. Wars always have kind of the same logic. What really changes is the intensity of that war. And I'm talking about the war not as, war, but war as a universal phenomenon. So it's obvious that war changes because they have different objectives, they have different, equipments, they have different, all the various kind of differences that can exist in an actual war. But these differences are dictated from something that exists external to the world. But war as an act of violence is always the same thing. It doesn't change in time and history. You can't objectively say that today wars are less, they're kind of more constrained in the way they're waged. Because von Clausewitz even said at the very beginning, if you remember it, one of the I think the very first paragraph, he says that that when he makes the comparison between the wars of these civilized nations and one of the savages, it says, the wars of the nations the civilized nations are kind of seem to be more controlled because there are not senseless slaughter of civilians. Usually, I would add, von Clausewitz perfectly knows it, and therefore there are this kind of greater. There is kind of greater. Nicery that seems to reduce also from the amount of sheer destruction. But this is first of all debatable because also as he observes, actually the progress of civilization doesn't make wars less destructive. On the contrary, and this is quite evident. It's not that progress brought to less deadly weapons to be built. Quite the contrary. Von Clausewitz simply explains that by saying that civilized nations have a kind of a more reasonable decisional process in the way wars are waged. So that, for instance, the census slaughter of civilians is not something you do because you actually care about civilians as themselves, as other people, but you do it because fundamentally the consequences that occur if you kill those civilians are going to be harsher for you. This is, I would say, this also opens to very wide philosophical considerations about things like human rights. I mean, human rights, it's not that they exist in themselves. Who is that actually believes that there is a law that is created that actually has a real ground. It may be based on a moral ground, but that moral ground stems from you. So it's always subjective. And what exists in this sense at the base, and not because you may not be inspired, for instance, by natural law. As you know, I'm not a moral relativist, but I still believe that moral is subjective, which are two different things. Not the moral is relative. The moral is subjective, so it stems from the individual. And the individual, in my opinion, in the social contract, creates, it's like homo homini lupus, fundamentally, like in Hobbes. He creates, and in other just naturalists, fundamentally, he creates the social contractualist, that the that society and its laws are not created because individuals are actually so philanthropic that by nature that they they decide to extend laws to protect everybody because they're actually happy of protecting someone. Because if they extend the law to everybody, they don't make exception. So they make it universal, so wherever you are, you can get those rights. And this naturally entails a universal nature and everything that is built culturally speaking. And I'm not trying to tear it down, because I also believe it works, but I do believe it works like this. So in war it's like that, is that also violence is delivered in a way that finds every time a kind of a political justification on subjective base. So that's why we have things like the Geneva Convention. Not because a bullet is kind of more or less deadly than another one. Yeah, of course, there are certain weapons that are banned, like napalm, stuff like that. But, I mean, you have phosphorus bombs. I don't know what's worse, actually, but how would you prefer to be killed, actually? With a chemical agent or with a rifle? I don't know, really, personally. You're still killing the person. You may increase its sufferance, and that's kind of, we don't want that stuff. But at that point, war is mitigated because people are more mindful about what could happen to them if they were to be found in the same condition. But still, the Geneva Convention doesn't say you don't have to kill, because in certain circumstances you can kill. You can kill. If you're shot first, you can answer fire, you can respond fire. Because that's it, and that's how war. So not even these rules actually are denying war, and that they're virtually irrelevant when it comes to actual war and how it is fought. Because we all know what happens in war. People get literally blown up all over the place. And that's the point of war. That's the only one. Have you ever seen a person bursting to pieces, like being gunned down by an MG, something like that? You basically got wiped out. You don't have any physical consistency anymore. That's what war is. So that never changes. That doesn't change it in the essentials, in the potential. The potential is unleashed only by politics, because war is just a continuation of politics by other means. So if you send an army of observation, or you just nuke a country, the difference there is not made by war. The difference is made by politics and the degree of energy that is given to that war. That's the real point. And this is dramatic. This is very dramatic because von Clausewitz is not hiding anywhere. He's telling you straight and simple how it is. And to deny this because we are scared by it, it's stupid. It's like saying, to a little child not to touch fire in the chimney, because you tell him that fire can burn him. So denying that war is like this is like saying to that child, "Oh, don't think about the fire. Just behave as if it wasn't there." So the child goes there and gets burned. You need to get terrorized by the truth if you want to be able to cope with the truth. Okay, maybe not terrorized, but you need to understand even its most dramatic sides, because that's the truth, that's the reality. If you deny reality, you're not going anywhere. It really gets down to very simple concepts. If you deny reality in every field of human life, you're essentially doing something wrong. In terms of your even instinct of survival, because you're essentially creating problems and complications, and you're just distancing you from reality that is something from the truth that is something you should strive for, trying to reach, at least, even if you can't immediately, but at least to orientate yourself into the right direction. And that's the real point. And in my opinion, that's what really makes the difference in everything. So it's not just about war, but eventually war is one of the most dramatic, phenomena of our society. And it's not just a phenomenon, actually. It's not like, comes to rain, you know how it happens, but you can't really control it. Here, it's something you have the direct control of. Not as an individual, of course, but in part, a tiny bit, if as an individual, but as a whole society mostly. So why that's why the political responsibility, because of its paradigm, all its ethical and civic implications are so important. Because you, first of all, you can't escape from them, and secondly, they have a huge impact on the world you live in. So read about war, read about politics, read about things that happen all around you, because that's the only way not to get just a vague opinion of what's going on. It's it should really push you towards a scientific knowledge of reality. This is also how I think normally happens. I think the average person, the average person really, aside from Vom Krige now and everything, has some interest in the world at all times, and especially among men, or people who were there in the world and living and have this kind of also tendency towards the idea of leading, of controlling and managing society, because society is control, society is rules, society is functional as a hierarchy fundamentally. That people get interested into politics. Politics is kind of arguably also, I would say, the most debated, or at least the most hotly debated topic. It's what fundamentally rightfully warriors people the most. So I'm not saying that people are completely responsabilized, just think about their smartphones or something like that. They do live in a world where they evidently understand that something is going on, that they should be interested in, and that's why we have the media talk to us, albeit very poorly, very insufficiently, and very distortedly about what happens. But it's exactly in here is that most people seem to have a very approximated, superficial understanding of such things, and they stop to one point. I'm not saying I personally don't get excessively interested into politics. I think I've reached a time in my life in which politics is. I've never been particularly passionate about in politics. When I was younger, especially, I thought it was very even apolitical, and that's the point, because apolitical means apathic in some ways, and I think by nature I've never kind of liked people who were heavily involved into politics. When in high school you have already those kids who start being activists, politically speaking. Sometimes it's fine, because it really depends on what they are driven by, but that's the fundamental. But I've always been kind of annoyed sometimes by this mania of protagonism, of need to. I've always disliked exhibitionism in some way, which is kind of ironic, because I ended up making a YouTube channel that fundamentally is about me talking, but I don't consider it exhibitionism in the sense I rarely talk about myself, and even when I do it, it's for a name. And just like now, what I wanted to say, in fact, is that I always stayed away from politics. Now I arrived, even though I had evidently my political thinking, my political opinions, and so on. Now I have arrived at the point in my life in which I have the arrogance, let's say, of reading the news and saying, okay, I can read behind, I can read through the lines, fundamentally. What this means, how it's manipulated, why this newspaper is writing this, why it's delivering the content in such a fashion, what they're hiding to me. The most difficult thing to do and most dangerous thing to do is, in fact, not about misinformation, but information. That is, it's not really about what the media say that is poorly portrayed, let's say, but it's rather what they do not tell you. That's much worse. And that's the most powerful political misinformation you can make at that point. Not just disinformation, but probably misinformation. Because by the act of selecting certain information, you actually have an effect also on the information you have to tell, because you have to conceal in part, to modify it in part, to make it fitting with the absence of that other part. You realize also in here how much reciprocity exists. Very Clausewitzian in nature. So what I was saying is, I also stopped to this outrage of saying, okay, well, I can't learn about everything, because objectively during the day I have so many other things to do that I don't even have time to read whatever I want. And if I do, I have to work fundamentally, and I don't have time. So as many other people, I kind of stop to a level in which I have my own ideas, and I try to improve them though. Many people do not do this. And you talk sometimes with people who are 60 years old, 70 years old, they reason like 12 years old, because essentially they have stopped to that level. I don't know how I sound personally, but I at least think that I should better myself, that I should learn more, that I should stay open to new ideas, and that I shouldn't take dogmatically anything. But I think that really the worst part of it is that it's not that people stop to, because if this was only about ignorance, it would be fine. But the problem is people take some positions that are based on assumptions for which they have no grounds. There is no grounds for making them stand, fundamentally. That's the real problem to me. Is that if you decide that one guy, one party, one country, or one whatever is evil, and you stay from the side of the good ones, it's over. Because I personally think also that there are certain evil ideas, let's say. But that's the point, that's ideas. I stay open in the sense that I think that ideas can change other ideas and can build something more functional. I'm not saying better. I believe, as I told you, that there is kind of good and evil by certain standard. I also believe I'm a kind of moral cognitivist in some empirical way, but I do think that at one point it's not really about a matter of ideology. It's a matter about making things work. This is why I hate sometimes also intellectualism by itself, because intellectualism is very attractive, it's very enticing sometimes. It gives you these tools for which you can criticize effectively others, you can make appear, and it also makes you reason well. But I think that intellectualism doesn't actually cope with reality at best. It's something that you can do if you are so well acquainted to a certain reality that you can't even transcend what happens, because you kind of still know what it is, and that. But intellectualism to me means to remain in the Hyperuranian fundamentally, and being undetached from reality. So my aim personally is still to be surprised of how much I don't know, not rather being satisfied with what I know. Even if I do sound very opinionated, I believe that that's mostly the result of still being open and able to, at least I hope, to integrate new points of view, to develop. I mean, I personally think I have made a dramatic shift. I mean, if considering my past years, I don't know, 5 years ago, I reasoned in a way that for me today would be completely unacceptable. I mean, maybe not completely, but still that is very different, because I realize I have somewhat improved, and I have improved on a base that I kind of built all over my mistakes, my misunderstandings, and that brought me up. So you can sense that progress. And I believe that all humans progress in this sense, but I found that there are certain qualitative stages of improvement, so that you can maybe cumulate certain experience to combine it with your past one and kind of delve in it. But if you don't do certain things, if you don't dare to learn more, if you stop yourself fundamentally to just certain dichotomies, because usually it's also like that, you you are you're stopping, you're idling fundamentally. And by the way, the more you wait, the more it's difficult to change. So that is also very important. I would say when you spot a dichotomy in your life, you like to banally say, this is good, then it's evil, this is right, this is wrong. Well, I think that's a very powerful indicator to see fundamentally that something's going wrong, seriously wrong. Because that dichotomy exists, but it exists theoretically. And to prove it in real life, it makes a freaking lot of work that most of the times is not done by the people who in fact are kind of fans of these perspectives, and that remain in this very simplistic view of reality, where you don't try to get whether there are other options, because those options do not equate to a necessarily to a you see them maybe as a variation of that degree of good and evil, fundamentally, in intensity, but it's not really like that. It's really you giving for granted so many things that make your thought evil and not realizing it. So that dichotomy, good and evil, probably exists, and it's also pretty well rooted in our world, but stopping means to make you evil. That's the real point. If you still think you can better yourself, you're fine. Because even if you're sinning, let's say, you still have an option to redeem yourself, because you are able to understand your mistakes. If you're just bubbling about the same old things all your life, talking always about the same topics, about the same, criticizing all the same stuff, that's not a good sign. It's not a positive sign. You should do something else. You should pick up a book and read. I'm not saying that real experience, real life do not bring you to reflect, but knowledge definitely helps you. Is vital to help you process in this. And I really mean vital, because you can't really do without. Because the human mind sometimes is, it's very flexible, but it needs a structure. It needs a guide, and that's what happens when you read the Vom Krige. You're not just reading an opinion. This is the point that I often make with von Clausewitz, that it's like when you don't know an author. This happens. How many times there are so many books to read, for instance, and we all know a book that is very famous and that we still have not read. An author, at least, maybe that. And we have our own prejudice that can be positive or negative. And until you don't read that author, his work, his work, you say, okay, well, it's not so important. It's a bit foggy. What might ever be that it's so important to read? And then until you don't read it, you miss something that when you effectively learn what you missed up to that point, you say, wow, did I really miss this? Did I really leave without knowing this before? Well, now I know it. It might be a small thing. It might even be difficult to apply in real life, but now I know it and I feel better. And this is how knowledge works, is that we are all very unconfident when we are presented with a very different reality. It's normal. It's how we are programmed biologically through evolution to be always scared of reality. Not scared of reality, but to be always cautious naturally, towards reality, but also to being confident towards new things, towards something that we still don't know how to process. And in fact, I think most of also individual difficulties come when people uh, usually people have problems they don't want to solve because they fear the way they would be solved. They don't really know how the process would happen. They don't want to know. They prefer just to remain in the shade of ignorance, to say, okay, I feel safer here. But it's a very instinctual, emotional feeling that in front of knowledge of science doesn't really work like that. Well, von Clausewitz is science. It's not just a guy stating his own opinion like I can do. Von Clausewitz is really telling you how real life works, and not in that kind of emotionalistic way usually war is told. Another thing I hate is when in pop culture war is told just in dramatic terms. I mean, find any kind of documentaries made on some war. It's made up for targeting an audience that is the average watcher. And this average watcher, what does he or she want? He or she wants just the emotional story of the little kid with the mother, and the war is terrible. And think, is there anyone who has a scientific interest in understanding what that freaking war was in the first place? How that worked, why it was fought, why that kid and his mother suffered in the first place, and in order maybe to avoid it and not just to feel, that bad for them, and not doing actual anything of help with them. It's those people who say, now let's just, as in a main catastrophe, let's just pray. Why don't you pay some money for helping those people, you dumb idiot? Not saying that pray, I also pray, I do, but I don't think it's something that I do for, something magically to change while I'm sitting here. It's something I actually do to prepare myself to do something about things actively, because if there is not someone who actively does it, things are not gonna be solved by themselves. So this is it. Like, ignorance equates to saying, okay, I don't want to get involved. And that's hypocrisy. That's a way of pretending you know reality by deeming something unimportant that you actually not even know, just because you feel challenged by it. That your safe spots, if it sounds challenged by it. It's stupid. We're meant to go out there in the wild and to die if necessary, if something is important enough. And that's how we should consider the whole story. If you don't do it, civilization does not progress. As ugly as it may sound, even war, in its destructiveness, in its atrocity, in itself is something that has civilization progressing. And it's rather the political intentions that have been evil that have brought to war, that it was unnecessary, and there might have been. But war puts under a pressure that obliges you to think rationally, to think scientifically, so that even when you study it, you start learning things not as an opinion, not as if you studied, I don't know, history of fashion, so you just care about, what freaking colors people in the 16th century wore. That's just, I don't know, history of fashion is surely an interesting thing, but if those are your interests in terms of banal explanations, you should look at society behind fashion, for instance, production, how the system works, and that's still science. Well, war brings you to discover way more things that you could ever believe. You could even expect to know about your own human nature. Because it's that brutal that you can't find an explanation like, oh well, humans just like to do it. It's so stupid. It's basically you're saying that, war is so terrible that we're fond of it because we're crazy. Is this seriously your explanation? Study the Vom Krige, please. try to understand something about the world you live in, which perhaps is something that will help us all benefiting from. So this is my point. I know I get very I like to use this term opinionated, like, very convinced about this, but I truly do. And as you understand, I don't do it because I have a just one point to start from. There are many considerations that bring to it, and this is kind of, and most of them I drove them in fact from the Vom Krige, because the Vom Krige is something you can't read. You have to reason on it. You have to study it. So your brain has to make some effort in order to process the information that is in there. And so beware of reality. Literally, be aware of reality, because it's a very dangerous place to be, and generally it's also very basically learning the hard way is the only way to learn it. That's how I see it, frankly, and there are not many other ways to put it. Life in this sense is a very dramatic experience. You can't deny it. You can't think it's just a myth or something that happens for some strange reason you don't want to have anything to do with. Things happen, you have to cope with them, and if you don't do it with some scientific approach, if you don't make your brain work, you're just staying the way you are. And if there is something that history teaches us, is that basically those who do not have the means to adapt, to change mostly, because to adapt is more like an evolutionistic thing, but with politics, society, and war, really is what you see is that idlers get wiped out. They don't make it. History divorces you, and society is way more complicated to look at, but not much because of the scientific approach, but actually because of some lack of will, lack of perspective. Because also from Clausewitz you realize that this whole system that he has built, is built fundamentally not on a purely mathematical base. I mean, obviously von Clausewitz uses a scientific language. He is very much into science, into philosophy, also naturalistically meant. But what he's telling you is that if you really had to count all the factors that happen, you would never get to the solution. Here, what he says, and now it's perhaps not very clear because we still remained a little bit in the field of theory, but then when he starts explaining things like attrition, fog war, etc., you realize that at that point there are other ways that are kind of non-scientifical to determine what you have to do. So you also have to learn to orientate yourself on a certain base that it's mostly based not really just on intuition, but an intuition that is naturally backed by evidence, by experience especially. So science is something you build when you're able to have the perfect knowledge of what is going on. Well, reality is very difficult like that. There is something that is going on, we know it, but the problem is we don't know exactly why and how, in which measure. So we have necessarily to use science when this is possible, but at the same time we have to know how to use science. That's the real point. You have to find the conditions of some other quality that helps you solving problems. Because if you had to solve problems just with a calculator in your hand at all times, society would be frozen. We would all die in a few days, fundamentally. This can't happen, and therefore you have to rely on certain qualities that are kind of important. I remember Descartes when he says, he talks about the esprit de géométrie and the esprit de finesse, that he distinguishes in this kind of a sort of scientifical and philosophical spirit. In fact, it is meant here esprit as sort of kind of subtleness fundamentally, or finesse is maybe more subtleness, but whatever. It's really, even in there, in rationalism, Descartes was famously a rationalist. He said, yeah, okay, there is a spirit of geometry, but a spirit of science, mathematics, if you want, but there is also something else. There is something that pertains to a more strictly human dimension. It's also faulted because, you know, here there is also the matter of original sin. Descartes was a rationalist, and yet he was naturally and perfectly, obviously, a Christian as well, given his times and the world. And so you can't cope with this human limits fundamentally. I mean, yeah, first of all, they're always there, so you can't cope with them in the sense that they can't be eliminated, but at the same time, you can't even deny them. So even the concept of original sin, our deep and miserable limits in many ways are meaningful in life, because essentially civilization is a product of these limits. This is what all philosophies, all religions basically say. All evidence is that our society is based, our civilization is based, also science tells, social sciences tell us, everything tells us that our civilization is based not on, you know, some positive progress that happened for no reason, but it happened actually to put a patch over our faults, to try to make our existence less miserable. So it's been built through struggle, through sufferance, through efforts that evidently today we don't even, you know, we even give for granted. We just want more and more. They don't understand where even what we have got from. That's why you also have to study history, because if you don't understand where, you know, how we got here, it's a bit difficult to understand what are the right choices to do now, because we are on a path. I'm alarmed by, you know, how the children born in the last years, last generation, are sometimes completely abstracted from an historical perspective. They don't care, chiefly because their parents are a bunch of ignorant pigs, and this is the sad truth. But they're not even able to educate them. But this is dramatic, because if you think that the world will become a sort of place where with a sort of monotemporal dimension, where the past does not exist and doesn't count, this normally happens because of ignorance. In fact, it happens because people do not study history. So I think that we have the means now to educate better. We are kind of largely more educated than we were in the past, so even our historical knowledge is not so bad, but it's not so bad when it's actually delivered. I think a great problem in today's generations is actually the way that they are taught, and the way education systems are collapsing in many ways, without a proper alternative that in my opinion should even be an alternative. I personally hate this idea that should be an alternative education, because I think certain means are good, but they are so good, in fact, that many teachers are not up to the task, many parents are not up to the task, and therefore it collapses. But it does not collapse because of the model. Of course, the model has to work in reality, but we also can't go back just because people are lazy. I think we are getting all lazy. That's the real problem, and it's true because we live in conditions that bring us to be lazy. So also, without justifying ourselves, we can definitely motivate this and observe that, yeah, somewhat there has to be a sort of a change, but we also have to do it in a way that is not based on the sake of changing for itself, but for actually understanding what works, what works for real. Whatever, this kind of went way too long than it should be. However, For now, this was the 11th chapter, the 11th paragraph, sorry, and we'll get to actually a shorter one on another occasion, on the 12th. In fact, that is kind of more contained, but here we have a very interesting group of considerations that await us soon with our Vom Krige. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.